Good afternoon, and welcome to our opening program for Illuminate, Contextualizing Asian American Women's Stories through the Archives. Illuminate spotlights the stories and lives of Asian American women whose collections are held in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. The exhibition provides viewers an opportunity to contextualize the often invisible and forgotten histories of Asian and Asian American women in the United States, examining how understandings of race, ethnicity, gender, citizenship, and migration impact the collective memory of a nation. This program will feature Erika Lee, the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Foundation Faculty Director of the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, Radcliffe Alumni Professor, Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and Bay Family Professor of History, Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Eunsong Kim, Associate Professor of the Department of English, Northeastern University, and Shaina Lu, artist, educator, and community activist. The conversation will be moderated by Victor Betts, curator for collections on ethnicity and migration, Schlesinger Library, Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We also want to gratefully acknowledge the Helen Blumen and Jan Acton Fund for Schlesinger Library Exhibitions for their support of this exhibition. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program, and the speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short. This will enable them to address as many as possible in the time we have. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor over to the curator of this exhibition, my colleague, Victor Betts. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrina, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Victor Betts. I am the curator for the collections on ethnicity and migration at the Schlesinger Library, and the curator for our newest exhibition, Illuminate, Contextualizing Asian American Women's Stories through the Archives, that just opened to the public. So I'd like to begin by framing the exhibition and talk a little about some of the elements in the exhibition that you can expect to see if you have a chance to visit us in person. The exhibition begins with an 1874 pamphlet about the case of Ah Fang, a Chinese woman brought before the Circuit Court of the United States for the District of California. From there, the exhibition highlights historic events that have impacted Asian and Asian American women up to the present day. Materials from our collection connect and contextualize these stories, demonstrating how the lived experiences of these women were not isolated from, but rather inherently tied to the cascading effects of US economic, military, political, and legal policies, and an expanding global empire. The presence of the United States in Asia and the Pacific was a major catalyst for the migration of Asian people to the United States. American intervention throughout Asia during the 19th and 20th centuries were often fueled by racism, sexism, Orientalism, and xenophobia, as evidenced by many items on display. Asian Americans are a vastly diverse and ever-growing diasporic group, yet the histories and roles of Asians and Asian Americans are often forgotten, misremembered, or even erased from national historical narratives. Acknowledging such absences in the archives can be revealing. With this in mind, Illuminate suggests a critical approach to understanding the history of the United States, and it asks us how this reframing might challenge and change our collective memory and sense of identity. In centering and celebrating the stories of Asian and Asian American women, often relegated to the margins, Illuminate insists on their recognition and importance within American history. When you visit the exhibition, you'll see collection materials on the walls and display cases, but you'll also notice two other things. First, selected events throughout Asian American history alongside the collection materials on the walls. And secondly, questions for viewers to reflect and think about the items they are seeing. These additional information and questions are meant to have visitors think more deeply about absences and gaps in the archives, voice and gaze in existing archival materials, and how one might describe historical materials and records. There's also a section that explores Asian American identity, large-scale artwork by local artists An Ho and Shaina Lu, and finally, an area to reflect and write down your own thoughts about the exhibition in the center of the gallery. So with that said, I'm now delighted to welcome our speakers who will each talk about an item from the exhibition. Up first, we have Erika Lee, who will talk about materials that are used to tell particular histories. Erika?
Thank you so much, Victor. I'm really happy to be here as part of the this opening virtual program, and also to be here in the Schlesinger Library with the exhibit just outside my door. So first, this photograph that we're looking at today is one of the exhibit items, and it is important for a number of reasons. This is a photograph taken by Jessie Tarbox Beals during her assignment at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, also known as the St. Louis World's Fair. And it's important for a variety of reasons. First, Beals is considered one of the first women photojournalists in the United States. We're so fortunate to have her papers here at the library. But in the class that Victor and I are teaching this semester, Asian American Women in the Archive, we've used this photograph and others like it to ask questions related to the history of women in America, other questions that don't often appear in the textbooks. For example, we have asked our students, what does this photograph tell us about Asian American women's history? Or more correctly, how Asian American women have usually been recorded in history. And in answering this question, it's clear that this photograph is really a perfect example of how Asian women have typically been understood and represented in early 20th century America, and oftentimes still today, as objects rather than actors, and recorded in history through a white gaze. So for example, this photograph is one in a series that Tarbox Beals took of the so-called living exhibits at the St. Louis World's Fair. The World's Fair was an extremely popular event. There were something like 20 million people who attended the fair across its 8-month run in St. Louis. For these living exhibits, the United States brought over 1,000 people, especially indigenous peoples, to be exhibited in what today we would consider human zoos. These exhibits help to not only provide Americans with a view of life on the other side of the planet, but it also helped to justify ongoing US colonization, especially in Asia and in Latin America. And in doing so, it helped to spread ideas that suggested that non-whites were less civilized than whites, and that they were unfit for American citizenship. This is a period of not only expanding US empire, but also increasing mass migration from around the world. And in this photograph, we can see these unequal power dynamics and some of these ideas about racial science codified in what Tarbox Beals captured on camera. So for example, the woman at the center of the frame is an object. She's an object of curiosity. She's being stared at, she's under scrutiny, She is not a historical agent in charge of her own history or how she's being recorded. In fact, this photograph is recorded for the purpose of others, in this case, the US government. And when we look at the metadata or the description of this item in our finding aid, we also note that the way in which this item is recorded and described is also full of absences and misrepresentations that echo these unequal power dynamics. For example, the official caption of this photo is, quote, "4 Anglo fairgoers watching a Japanese woman weave outdoors. Woman is seated on a small block of wood. Her sons stand near her, leaning against the wall of a thatched dwelling." So if you think about this description, the woman herself is not even the main subject of the photograph. The official title centers the 4 Anglo fairgoers. And Jessie Tarbox Beals did not bother recording her name, the names of her children, or anything about her life story. So she is preserved in history as this nameless woman in this living exhibit. We do know that she is Ainu, an indigenous minority colonized by Japan, and likely would not have identified as Japanese, as the description does. These are some of the things that we've discussed in our class this semester, but it also raises just these larger questions about archives and the production of history. So let's go to the next slide, if we could. Victor and I have used, actually the next one, please. Victor and I have used other materials in the library's collections to explore where, when, and how Asian American women appear in archives and what these presences and absences tell us about archives and the production of history. In this slide, we brought our students to Houghton Library to examine the collections on Anna May Wong and also Chang and Ang. Chang and Ang were the conjoined twins from Thailand, aka the original Siamese twins, who gained great fame touring in the United States during the mid-19th century. And then if we could go back to the previous slide, back in the Schlesinger Library, we've also been able to explore some of the newly acquired collections, like those of chefs Gracia Chu and Madhur Jaffrey, to ask how Asian American women have recorded and documented their own histories. So Gracia Chu on the left was a well-known chef. She was a teacher, a cookbook author. She's credited with introducing Chinese cuisine to Americans during the Cold War. She was known as the First Lady of Chopsticks. She attended Wellesley College. She taught cooking classes at the China Institute in Manhattan for 30 years, beginning in 1954. She published 2 very popular cookbooks, including The Pleasures of Chinese Cooking, which came out in 1962. It became a bestseller. And this photograph that we have here is part of a series promoting that cookbook in 1963. It was actually, there was also a video that was produced to promote the cookbook. So this is a big deal for both Gracia Chu, but also Chinese American history in the United States. We are so fortunate to have Gracia Chu's papers. She donated them to the Schlesinger Library in 1986. They include her personal papers, they include her awards, biographical documents, correspondence, recipes and menus from her classes, lectures and speeches, and also her cookbook collection. And then the photograph on the right is Madhur Jaffrey. Madhur Jaffrey is a celebrated actress. She studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in the UK. She's known for her work in Merchant Ivory films like Shakespeare Walla in 1965 and also in Bollywood films. In addition to her acting career, Jaffrey has been hugely successful as a chef and cookbook author who is credited with introducing and popularizing Indian cuisine and cookery to British and American audiences. Her book, Indian Cookery, which was published in 1973, led to a cooking show in 1982. It's still widely used and loved today. And when one of our colleagues, archivist Emily Mathey, came to our class a few weeks ago, she showed us how she's processing Jaffrey's papers. We got a glimpse to see how rich this collection is, how large it is. There are notebooks with travel and recipe notes. There's correspondence with friends and colleagues about both her acting and her cooking, and also several terabytes of born digital material. And we're able to see clearly the difference that these kinds of collections that are created, preserved, and donated by Asian American women themselves, the difference that they make in our library and also our teaching and our research. This contrast between collections like Jessie Tarbuck's Beals, where Asian women mostly appear as objects, versus collections like Gracia Chu's and Madhur Jaffrey's has been really productive for our own students. As one of them recently wrote after examining collections like Jessie Tarbuck's Beals, quote, "Archives often reflect the curiosities of those who document Asian subjects rather than the subjects themselves." And then after we examined the collections of Asian American and Arab American activists like Helen Zia and Carol Haddad, another student reflected, quote, "Zia's newspaper clippings and Haddad's resource lists for Arab American feminists do not merely record activism, they constitute activism, producing historical presence where structural forces impose absence." So with these and other collections, we're beginning to be able to teach and write more fuller histories, and to know that the legacies of these and so many other women are preserved and accessible for future generations here at the library. There's so much more in the exhibit. We hope to see you in the gallery soon. And now I welcome Victor back to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Erika. Next, we'll pass the floor to Eunsong Kim, who will talk about Merle Wu and her experience researching the archives for fragments of Asian American women in the Schlesinger Library's collections. Eunsong?
Hi, Victor. Thank you so much for organizing us and for putting this wonderful exhibit together. I also want to thank my panelists, Erika and Shaina. I've learned so much from Erika, your work, and I teach it all the time that this is a particular honor. So I wanted today to talk about my experience looking at Pat Parker's archives at the Schlesinger, and then also finding elements of the relationships that she had with Merrill Wu and other people like Willis Kim, which I can talk about in the Q&A. So from this poster, I think we can see that this is Unbound Feet, and so I'm just going to read a little bit of what I prepared. So I find flyers for the performance group Unbound Feet and Pat Parker's archive, and I reach out to each of these members to see if they might speak to me. I was particularly delighted to see that Parker kept the flyers of not only their reading series, but newsletters distributed as the group had a split. Nellie Wong, Merrill Wu, and Kitty Sue sent out newsletters that described their political positions as socialists, lesbian, queer women who wanted the group to take radical positions against US empire to support student movements. So I think for all of us here, it should not be a surprise that Black and Asian American poets organized and supported one another throughout the 70s and 80s. And you can see this in June Jordan's archives, Janice Mirkatani's poems, some of her like unpublished poetry, including the organizing that she did for Poetry for the People, are actually in June Jordan's archives. And yet this kind of story, the story of their relationships, are often embedded into the archive, obscured from public discourse. Too often we're taught about individual poets and individual poems rather than communities, intimacies, and disagreements. So I'm like looking through the archives, thinking about like, how did these poets lived? Who did they love? Did they fight? How did they fight? The flyers for Unbound Feet and Parker's archives are marked 1981. A year later, in 1982, there are news clippings about Merrill Wu's firing by the Asian American Studies program at the University of California, Berkeley. The various newspaper reports kept by Parker describe how Wu supported student critiques against austerity measures, which included the cutting of community language programs. The university cuts from the agendas most needed by the students, community language programs. And I think that it's so wonderful to think about a moment where community language programs and something like student tutoring centers were offered by the university. And the universities the engagement of the dissolution of such programs speaks to the ways that the programs were actually forged, direct student action and activism. In the reorder of things, Rod Ferguson demonstrates the ways in which ethnic studies and gender studies programs were created to appease and intellectualize anti-war, anti-imperialist campus protest. Given this fraught history, these departments and their programs will and remain under constant threat of dissolution. So I was so delighted that Pat Parker kept news clippings and pamphlets concerning Wu's wrongful termination lawsuit, just because I had not actually learned about this part of her life. And I was particularly it led me to sort of see how she had co-written something with Audre Lorde in a pamphlet titled Apartheid USA, in which she actually writes about this case. She writes about the wrongful termination, but then winning against this kind of taking it to court and then winning, being reinstated, and then being dismissed, and then winning in arbitration. And then of these efforts, she writes, quote, "I was fortunate to be reinstated just in time to participate in the explosive anti-apartheid movement that broke out on the Berkeley campus in the spring of 1985, end quote. So once again, I don't think it should be surprising to learn how Asian American activists worked with students against the South African apartheid regime, and that Pat Parker was interested in these connections and then kept the connections in her archives. And also, this is not often what's foregrounded or advertised in liberal narrations about history or the past. Liberal narrations often emphasize linear progression and insist on positivistic and individualistic development. According to them, history is not a circular loop waiting to explode through attachment. Wu chronicles the students expelled in the 1980s for engaging in anti-apartheid activism. What might we say about the continuums of such institutional harms? Can we go to the next slide? In Parker's archives, there's a letter from Merle Wu dated October 14th, 1977. The letter is about Parker's upcoming class visit, which details parking, coordinating the honorarium, and student reading requests. The letter is written with the care of an institutional veteran who wants to demystify its policies and find amendable workarounds. Correspondingly, in 1981, Wu sends Parker some of the newsletters concerning Unbound Feet with a personalized note for support. At the bottom of the note, we can read Parker's handwritten comments. I don't know if you can see it, but it's faint and at the very bottom, in which she writes, quote, "I wanted very much to talk to you about this in the car, but the opportunity never came up," end quote. So half letter, half journalesque. Parker's marginalia sparks all that the archive does not contain, but lures us towards the intimate conversations between friends in the car, all that was said and unsaid, and also through her archive, we have a way of understanding her relationships, Parker's relationships, as well as Wu's relationships, which becomes another way of understanding Asian American lives, literature, and history. Could we go to the next slide? So their friendship and relationship continued throughout the decades. And I want to thank Mi Schling and Emily Wu Yamakazi for sending me this excerpt from Merrill Wu's archive, from her archive. Though Parker passed in 1989, Wu continued to write about her and remembered her in public. In a 1999 op-ed titled "For Pat Parker and Radical Dykes Everywhere," Wu writes about Parker's poetry, her activism, and the visit to her class chronicled in just the slide before. She writes, "Pat Parker was exploring something very new in the early 1970s, and since we haven't had the revolution yet, I bet she has something for young, queer, and questioning youth today. So the archivist and ethnographer Jarrett Drake formatively critiques archives as carceral spaces that can be carceral spaces, wherein histories, documents, and memories are institutionalized, in pointing to how the visiting of an archive can often parallel prison visitation with various ID and security checks, and how an archive may work to sequester conversations and act as a site of exclusion. Drake cautions against the easy romanticization of archival objectivity and its evidentiary promise, and asks for more criticality to be practiced when interacting with the objectification of memory. So with that kind of caution, I think it's really important to visit the archive and the people and read their histories with cautious admiration. I know that that's how I've been sort of interacting with Pat Parker's archive in particular. But I do approach the language that they leave behind in journals and letters with the longing for a secret they may have that this present does not yet contain. Like many others, I approach their drafts, their language, because they were trying something, and I want their relationships and connections to be extended and woven most explicitly into our present and future. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunsong. Last but not least, we have Shaina Lu, who will talk about her artwork that is part of the current exhibition and the role of art and visual materials in Asian and American storytelling. Shaina?
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you for having me and on our art in your exhibit or in the exhibit. And thank you so much, Erika and Eunsong. I learned so much. I was taking notes, but almost forgot I had to say things too. So something I've been thinking about a lot is cultural tradition. And I think this kind of informed the 3 window designs, what it means for us as Asian diaspora in America, how we pass it down or preserve it, and when or how we might want to think about letting some of it go or how we might let it go. So these 3 windows that are coded in primary colors, blue, red, yellow-ish, explore those ideas, drawing on some archival material from the Schlesinger Library, as well as some other, like the Northeastern database. We have I used a lot of reference photos from Chinese Progressive Association, written documentation in the form of like articles, essays, and then some books, on oral histories from Boston Chinatown and other miscellaneous sources. So I'll just go through the windows kind of in order from left to right. So the first window, I was super excited to see some of Gun Kwok's archival materials in the Schlesinger Library when I visited it. So Gun Kwok, which was founded in 1998, is an all Asian women lion dance troupe. And these were donated by the founder of the troupe. I was super excited to see these, not only because I'm a lion and dragon dancer now, but because I actually got my start in lion dancing in Gun Kwok about like a decade ago in 2015. So the title of that piece, which I'll read Gun Kwok's English translation, is "A heroine will not admit defeat to the hero." And I love that, like the poetic nature of that translation. Other people might translate it some more similarly to like women are just as good as men, or women are not inferior to men. But I love that Gun Kwok kind of, I love how they phrased it. So I want to talk a little bit about lion dancing, just because it's really interesting and fun. And I think you might find it interesting as well. So I just want to note that Gun Kwok uses a different style of lion head than the one that's depicted in this picture. This is a foot san head. Gun Kwok actually uses a style of lion dancing called hak san. Just a fact. So the image is actually drawn from my own like current experiences of lion and dragon dancing in another troupe right now called Walam, which is a school run by 3 women sifu, which is pretty amazing in the martial arts world. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that is so. So lion and dragon dance, for those of you who might not have seen it before, is traditionally practiced by Kung Fu martial artists. It's like kind of this like ceremony or dance and that brings good luck and drives away evil spirits. A lion is operated by 2 dancers, and then the dragon is operated by a team of dancers, depending on the length of the dragon. And the dragon is always chasing something called the pearl. Traditionally as well, a lot of these arts are very male dominated. You might find some groups today that still resist allowing women to dance in the lion or even touch some of the instruments like the drum and the gong and things like that. But however, I think as you know, we enter the modern era, a lot of these things no longer hold true. So what this really made me think of, today being, a woman lion dancer and also in a school of women sifu and knowing, spaces like Gunkwok and others exist, thinking about like, what are like the traditions that are really important and special to us? How do we hold on to them? And then what parts of them can we move on from? Like, how can we take what's really beautiful from this like cultural practice? And how can we move forward with it? And then just to shout out some other line dance groups that exist. So in Vancouver, there's actually a framed photo of an all-women's line dance team that dates back to the 1930s. This is in the Hongxing Athletic Club. Nearby, we have all-women's troupe Nuwa, which is very exciting. And then now we actually have troops in New York that are specifically queer and non-binary, which is just really, really exciting in the world of lion dance and martial arts. And now I'll move on to the middle piece, which is a bunch of spices, herbs, and aromatics from different Asian culinary traditions, kind of like spilling out from above. Like I'm imagining like if you stand in front of the window, you can kind of like smell or see all these aromatics in front of you. So the title comes from an article I read by Anada Rati about Madhur Jaffrey. So I'm really excited that Erika actually brought up these cookbook examples in her talk because I'm going to talk about them a little bit. So my question for this drawing was, how do we transmit recipes from generation to generation? I love, that we got to look at Gracia Chu and Madhur Jaffrey's cookbook collections in Erika's slides. So I'm really drawn to thinking about food, not just because I love eating it, but also in thinking about how it preserves tradition and cultures in Asian American immigrant communities. So food culture to me, it shapes community in lots of different ways, like thinking about gatherings, what's built in the kitchen, what's shared there, like the things that are kind of shared in like the in-between spaces, while people are making and cooking and talking, and also what stories might be shared. The title comes from the essay that I mentioned earlier. It's called The One Piece of Madhur Jaffrey Advice I Live By. So the piece of advice that she distills is see the dish cooked in front of your eyes. And what she was talking about was how often written recipes kind of like are bungled in some ways. Sometimes people use colloquial names. They leave out things that feel really obvious to them in writing down these recipes. So she really felt like she needed to go to the person that was cooking it and then like watch them cook it, learn how to cook it directly from them. And I love that because I think about how we transmit like traditions and how we sometimes you're like, why can't there just be a guide for like how to do like a cookbook? But all the things that might be lost in just looking at a cookbook and what might exist when you kind of like get that oral history or that visual history of how you learn how to cook that specific dish. And then I also wanted to include this food piece because I've been thinking a lot about like conversations about appropriation in food. And this is like something that kind of went into my children's book that I wrote. And I love that discussions and critiques of power, like making their way into spaces like on conversations about food and things like that. But this does also make me think about like the idea of authenticity, like what makes diaspora food authentic, and is authenticity real? Like what does that mean for us? And then my last one on the very far right is a celebration of the traditions of community organizing. And I wanted to just make a very joyful piece about, my love for organizing that has come from Boston's Chinatown. This piece is titled "They Didn't Do It for Themselves," which is part of a quote from, longtime Chinatown organizer, leader, former principal of the elementary school that I work at now, Suzanne Lee. The full quote is, "They didn't do it for themselves, they did it for their children and their future, for their family." So this was in response to, this is not pictured in illustration, but I'll tell you about it anyway because it's so interesting. This was in response to her talking about her organizing in the Boston busing crisis in 1974. So, Suzanne Lee, then a very young teacher, and I will give a very quick summary, and maybe I can help drop some links in the chat that you can, listen to her talk about it herself. When we think about the Boston busing crisis, we often think of it as a black and white struggle, thinking about how desegregation was really fought against by certain communities and things like that. But the story that was really interesting to me is the story of Suzanne Lee and immigrant Chinese mothers organizing a 3-day bus boycott during this time because their children, like Chinatown kids, were used as kind of a racial buffer during this busing crisis. So along that theme, I thought about different kind of Chinatown organizing highlights in which I felt that the community really stood up for itself. And all of these instances were really led by Chinese immigrant women or Chinese women organizers. At the very top is the combat zone or a combat zone protest. So Boston was one of the first cities to zone adult entertainment into one area. And of course, it was in Chinatown, which, I think many residents did not like and really fought against and organized against. So here at the top, you see this woman speaking on behalf of community control to a crowd. Underneath that, this is actually a young Suzanne Lee, who was a very busy person. She also founded Chinese Progressive Association. So in 1985, also the same year, they successfully launched a campaign for justice for Long Guang Huang, who was a victim of police brutality in Chinatown. And then below that are the Parcel C protests, or an image representing the Parcel C protests. So the Coalition to Protect Parcel C for Chinatown was convened to fight against, sorry, this is so much information, but I'm just gonna say it all, convened against basically Tufts New England Medical Center wanted to build a very, very large parking lot in Parcel C, which is a plot of land in Chinatown, which had originally been promised to the community as you could have it for a community center. So obviously, I think, well, I wouldn't say obvious, some people didn't feel that way, but to me, obviously, I think in weighing a community center versus a parking lot, I can see why, many Chinatown residents were organizing in favor of a community center and against this parking lot being built. And this is a very cool case for me, or a very cool piece of history for me, because it's right across the street from Josiah Quincy School, and it's also the site of 4 community nonprofits, one of which is one of the ones that I first worked at in Chinatown when I was just a young adult. So I think Parcel C is very exciting because it's kind of this story of how a community kind of rallied together. It's one of the first and rallied their non-English speaking immigrant community. And it's also one of the first cases of talking about environmental injustice in urban cities. Yeah. I think with that, I think I'll hand it back off to Victor.
Thank you, Shaina. Such powerful artworks, and just even more special to be able to hear from you, the curator, about the stories behind it. And so I'm really appreciative of this moment. So we will now pause to view a short slideshow from the installation of the exhibition, Illuminate, Contextualizing Asian American Women's Stories Through the Archives. After that, we will move to audience questions, so we'll see you shortly. All right, and welcome back, everybody. So we have about 15 minutes to take some questions from the audience that were submitted. So let me go ahead and take a look at what we have. And if you have a question right now, please feel free to enter those as well too. So the first question I have here is this the first such university archival exhibit in the US, or have other universities had similar archival projects? Um, I could probably answer that, and others please feel free in the panel to answer as well too. This is certainly not the first exhibition that features Asian American women's archival materials, but it is the first at the Schlesinger Library, so it is very special and unique. For those of you who may not know, the Schlesinger Library went through a renovation during the pandemic, and so we have a brand new or newish exhibition space. So we've had maybe five or six exhibition, and this is the first of its kind at the Schlesinger Library to feature Asian and Asian American women. So yeah, we're really excited about that. Any other comments from other panels about similar exhibitions elsewhere that you may have seen that focuses on Asian American women's stories?
We're lucky at this university that last year Harvard Art Museum did a really phenomenal exhibit on opium. And in that exhibit, the curators made a concerted effort to bring in not just the history of US-China relations and the opium wars in China, but also to consider how that impacted Asian American history. So some of the orientalizing stereotypes that were very much being driven by these unequal foreign relations in the 19th century absolutely had an impact on how Asian peoples were viewed in the United States. So sometimes Asian American history gets included in exhibits and projects that aren't explicitly about them, and that is happening more and more. But it only happens when curators and archivists make that explicit choice to do so.
Yes, and then I will say, and this was mentioned before, the Houghton Library, their colleagues over at the Houghton Library, there was in the past exhibition that focused on Anna May Wong and their papers over there. So that did happen over at the Houghton Library, and you can see the digital exhibition of Anna May Wong at the Houghton Library. If we just Google Harvard Libraries Anna May Wong exhibition, I'm pretty sure you'll probably find something. Okay. Any other comments before I move to the next question? All right, cool. What does the framing of Asian American help us to see and understand?
I'm happy to start us off, but I hope that my co-panelists and Victor, you too, can add your own thoughts. So the question is what does an Asian American framing help us to see? I think as many participants can understand, the Asian American communities are extremely diverse. And so every book, every exhibit, every piece of art, I think answers that question differently. So again, I hope that that others will offer their perspectives. But I think that one of the things that Victor and I try to do in our class and that I see out in the exhibit is to showcase diversity, to showcase diversity in all kinds. So not just national origin and ethnicity, but as Shaina's artwork shows, generation, to showcase diversity in terms of where Asian American history happens. So it happens in Boston, it happens here in Cambridge through Radcliffe. It also happens overseas. It happens today. It happened centuries ago. And I think it's that diversity which can be kind of frustrating, right? So if it's so diverse, then how do we find or define a center or the boundaries of it? But I also think it's also liberating to see both connections as well as contrasts, to see cross-racial solidarities, and to understand that Asian Americans, like any kind of community, is dynamic. It's ever-changing, and how I define a people or a community may be different than how someone else defines it. And so I think in the classroom and certainly through the exhibit, I think we're highlighting these questions so that visitors can interact with the materials and thoughtfully consider how they enter into this world, this community, this identity or not. So I hope that helps answer that question, but I know that that's just the beginning of how we think about things.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. And this one is, thank you, Erika, by the way. This is for Eunsong. Thank you for these engaging examples, the powerful examples in the collection. I was especially moved by the example of the coalitional politics in Dr. Eunsong Kim's remarks. What are some threads you'd all like to continue exploring on solidarities across differences within the pan-ethnic construct of Asian American communities within the archives?
Thank you so much for the question. And thank you, Erika, for sort of giving us the analytic for us to work with and work through, which is like how to think of Asian American as something that perhaps is difference-based rather than like looking for similarities, which might actually push us towards something that's smaller rather than expansive. So I will just say that like, I was really interested. I like love Pat Parker's work. I hope that that was so clear that like I came to the Schlesinger in particular because I wanted to read drafts of her poem "Don't Let the Fascists Speak," and just like the other drafts that she had. And I also know that she was in correspondence with Audre Lorde as she was recovering from cancer. And so I wanted to read those letters. And while I was looking through her drafts, I found the correspondence that I mentioned, the newsletters she kept about Merrill, but I also found like correspondences she had with the writer Willis Kim, so another friend of hers, and in a letter to Audre Lorde, as Pat Parker is kind of in the hospital, she says like, you know, my sisters came to visit me, and she lists like Willis and like all of these other kind of people. So it was something that it was, I think that there's something about kind of the category of Asian American, and doing an exhibit on Asian American archives is so important. And simultaneously, I think that many of these communities were embedded with each other, and they had relationships with each other, and they organized across, especially because of the political commitments that they had as like, you know, people like Pat Parker was a part of the Black Women's Revolutionary Council, and so like organized with people who were also kind of critical of U.S. empire, and I think that this shows up in the letters and the correspondences, and I think like asking to see kind of the direction and movement of political organizing is another way to sort of think about Asian American communities and history as well. I hope I answered some part of your question. Yeah.
Yes, and I will say Merle Wu is a really great example to really also, and we touched on this a little bit about fragments, finding fragments of records and evidence of Asian American women in archives in places you would otherwise not expect, right? And so along with Pat Parker, we have records or fragments of Merle Wu and Angela Davis's paper and Carol Haddad's Arab American Network, Feminist Arab American Network papers, and one other, I can't remember one other, but there's four instances. Oh, Persephone Press records as well too. So there's these moments that there's evidence that's there, but you just have to really dig deep and really get in, you know, sort of the weeds in order to find these moments in the archives.
You know, I will just add that in June Jordan's papers, you see like the poetry readings that were organized, the Free Angela poetry readings that were organized, and like Janice Mirkatani, like June Jordan. So you see like the sort of names, like Nellie Wong. Nellie Wong is also someone who like appears in like a lot of the community-oriented events. So the communities were absolutely embedded and working with each other, and you really get to see those relationships as you move through the collection.
Thank you, Eunsong. And I have a question for Shaina, and this is about using visual materials and artwork and graphic novels in this particular instance, and zines as well too. I teach the material. I teach zines and graphic novels and comic book created by Asian American women creators as a form of counterculture. And a way for Asian and Asian American women to really use their own voice and agency to tell their own stories. And one of the wonderful things I really love about Shaina's work is that she takes really complex, complicated histories and tells it in such a beautiful, creative, nuanced way that I really have not seen other graphic novels do. And the Sea zine, for example, about the Parcel Sea movement in Boston Chinatown that Shaina alluded to earlier, and Noodle and Bao. There's just so many layers thematically in that book. So Shaina, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what's your process like in taking these complex and complicated stories and really be appealing to a wider audience.
Sure. So I think maybe it's like easier for me to use like an example. So in writing Noodle and Bao, which is the book, the graphic novel that Victor was talking about, I did a lot of kind of like oral interviews with people that I recorded. So I did read through a lot of things. One of the books I read was Forever Struggle by Michael Liu. If you're interested in learning more about Boston Chinatown, that's a really great one. And I talked to people who were both, current community organizers and former community organizers. And basically I asked them like very similar questions. I was like, what can you tell me about like a really exciting organizing win that you had? Like, what do you consider to be community? Which is like such an interesting question to ask. So it was like a number of things. It was a number of like talking to people, reading these things. And then I think that kind of like informed how I wanted to write about the story that I wrote about in Noodle and Bao, which is a story about, it's like a fantasy-ish book, but it's about gentrification and like the struggles of like working class people fighting against development. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Absolutely, and a really beautiful way to really wrap up our conversation. So thank you so much, Shaina, for sharing that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we want to stick to the schedule. And I know we didn't get to every questions, but thank you all who submitted the questions. This concludes our program today. I want to thank Erika Lee, Eunsong Kim, and Shaina Lu for their thoughtful conversation, as well as our audience for the terrific questions. The exhibition, Illuminate, Contextualizing Asian American Women's Stories Through the Archive in the Leah and William Poorvu Gallery at the Schlesinger Library is now open. The exhibition is free and open to the public Monday through Fridays, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., all the way to January 23, 2026. Finally, today's program has been recorded and will be posted in about a week or so. For more information about current exhibitions and upcoming Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and take care.